This is American Zarathustra. Welcome back again on for episode 50. And wow, we have got a great guest today. Welcome to our guest, an awesome artist and vlogger from north of America, and that would be our buddy Gio from Gio's Sardonic Art Critic Corner. How are you today, Gio?
I'm very good.
Mhm.
It's funny. I For many years I always wanted to be a writer, and I
Mm.
sort of kick myself for not starting on YouTube quicker. But I guess writing is dead and podcasting is everything. So writing isn't dead, but we'll we
It's
could get into it a little
I
bit.
know what you mean. I mean, it's just so much easier to listen to something, and people are so busy doing things. But, anyway, you have a gift for writing, though, for sure. And speaking of someone who's got an amazing gift for writing, this segued perfectly into introducing Nullus, my dear friend. How are you, sir? Welcome back.
Hello, Donald, and hello, Gio, and hello to the audience.
Brilliant, brilliant.
Yes.
So I've had the pleasure of meeting Gio on Joel Davis's art panel. I'm thinking probably was it like 2 months ago or
Yeah.
something? Yeah. Sorry it took so long to get you on the show. That was a really enjoyable panel discussion. Anyway, I should probably put the link to that actually in the in show notes. People can go watch that after this show, for example. And yeah, we had a really rich conversation. I feel that there's actually some parallels with Gio and I both being visual artists, and then perhaps also in some philosophical realms as well. Did you major also in philosophy, Gio?
Yeah, I have an MA in philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
I don't like to wave. I have an MA in poli sci and philosophy, but poli sci was poly theory, but
Yeah.
yeah, I don't. I hate these theory cells that they wave their degrees around. But yes, I do have a background in philosophy. Yeah, I do.
So, and before I go any farther, I have to ask you about the beautiful icon that you're using, which is your a painting you did of a famous portrait of Guanyin Bodhisattva.
Oh yeah, see, you got it right off the bat.
Yeah,
That actually, speaking of philosophy,
yeah.
that is one of my first, I would say, symbolist or figure paintings that I did many moons ago.
Mhm.
And I actually ended up donating that to the department of my philosophy program. And
Oh,
they
wonderful.
have it in the lounge there, in the student lounge.
It's quite,
So,
yeah, it's quite
yeah.
lovely. I actually used to go, when I lived in New York City, I would go to the Metropolitan
Oh, yeah.
Museum at least once a month. I would go there as much as I could. And they have that actual sculpture there.
Mm.
It's when you walk in the room, I'm telling you, there's just an energy in that room that's completely unique and beautiful. And I spent hours drawing it myself and adoring it. To be honest with you, it's quite lovely. What's your interest in Guanyin or in Buddhism or Buddhist art or Eastern philosophy?
Well, I was before I came. I guess you could say came. Although I never really left, came back to my very Italian Mediterranean Catholic faith. I was very much interested in for many years. First in the works of Carl Jung, like this is way before Lobster Man. That then um then I was like sort of a new ager for many, like I guess the perennial school really is what my main forte was. And then when I went into philosophy, I wanted to do that, but then ended up down like a lot of like continental rabbit holes. But then when I initially went to my program, my whole MA thesis was basically taking the aesthetic philosophy of literati painting and Zen art and combining it with Deleuze and Guattari's theories of like subjectivity and 1,000 plateaus. That was like
Good God.
my yeah. I know it's
Wow.
one day I'll revive it, but
That can you give us sort of an abridged version? I mean, what like what?
oh god, it's been years.
Yeah.
Essentially, um, I tried to take a lot of it. I credit to two things. One, my supervisor, who was the head of the department at the time, he was one of the last like old school philosophy professors that like just totally doesn't, isn't like totally conforming to a
like old school.
like doesn't conform to the expectation of a philosophy professor.
Okay.
And another one would be the French sinologist Francois Julian, who really helped me because his work as a sinologist, but also someone who is trained in Western philosophy, really like helped bridge that gap, especially with the works of Heidegger and Hegel, right? So I really basically I was trying to argue that the picture of subjectivity in Deleuze-Guattari, which is very like, how shall I say, very fibrous and in the middle, and I guess like the buzz term would be like rhizomatic if you're in like those circles, like their theory of like the rhizomatic self that is involved with all of these different forces on a non-hierarchical plane. That's similar to the notion of this sort of like in Zen and Taoism, you have this evanescent non-self, shunyata, and so forth. And I really tried to bridge the gap. I mean, I think I was kind of unsuccessful because a lot of people, especially at that time when I was doing it, a lot of people, they have this impulse towards syncretism that compares huge swaths of philosophic differences. So I was sort of like in the same mode of thinking, but I think it was interesting in that the aesthetic of it really bridged the gap, because the notion of one's own, I mean, being is a complicated word, obviously, in the Eastern context, but let's say for simplicity's sake, the notion of one's being within the literati tradition of the landscape, that is something that comes a bit close to what Deleuze-Guattari, especially the one chapter, if you read in A Thousand Plateaus, it's called On Faciality, where they compare the various aspects of the embodied face and identity with the landscape in a lot of different sections. But then, of course, like a lot of, like woke tards, they'll like use that chapter to talk about the white majoritarian face and all that, I mean, Deleuze-Guattari, they have a very like Deleuzean studies has been wholly ceded to these like woke people. So it's kind of complicated when you take an interest in a lot of that sort of like post-structuralist thinking. So yeah,
it's part of the mission of this show is to take it back.
Yeah,
and that's why we're so glad to have you with us, and you speak intelligently and eloquently about these topics.
Thank you.
I think this is, I think the audience is well aware. I lived in Asia for 5 years. I studied I guess we'll say Chinese landscape painting in Japan and Taiwan for a very, very long time. It's not something I really show in this realm. That's the other Dan, it's sort of the normie Dan, if you will. And but it's a deep, deep, deep part of me. But anyway, so that's why it's so rare to find some other person in our sphere that I can talk to about it, But here's the thing: you're bringing up a fascinating sort of, I guess, maybe a bridge between these two worlds. The tradition of landscape painting in Europe is extraordinary. Extraordinary, and then so it's also in the East. And of course, they're different and unique, and they really reflect the biospirits of both the West and the East. And I feel that in my experience living in Asia and et cetera, there's a profound mutual admiration for people who are in the cultural zone. This isn't a political discussion, but within the cultural zone where we both admire each other and we respect each other in the sense of, through the lens of the arts, in terms of our history and our accomplishments and the spirit of it. They look upon us with the same amazement and wonder that we look upon them. And so that is one more reason why we must preserve our traditions, our culture, architecture, music, art, language, everything Western must be treated with, that it's extraordinarily precious. So, but I'd like to, if you can maybe I mean, there's so much we could talk about.
Oh,
But
yeah.
just
But
open.
even that, the notion of distance, I feel that, like, for example, in Japan, as you know, they're very fascinated with Francophone culture. They're very fascinated with French architecture, for
Oh, yeah.
instance.
Mhm.
But the beauty of the Japanese experience is that, well, and of course, like, yeah, I mean, I don't even want to mention the word wrestling, or we'll be here for 10 hours when it comes to Japanese wrestling. But the beauty is that they managed to synthesize a lot of cultures that have come from abroad, but yet at the same time, they have a very like strong sense of distance that comes
Mhm.
about from a strong sense of identity and a
Mhm.
sense of self.
Yeah.
But in those sort of cultural antipodes, they wouldn't exist if it was what is like the, you know, most common parlance that we talk about, like the gray goo of hyper like neoliberal modernity. It's that's you notice like there's a profound deculturation happening where culture is actively being destroyed on all fronts throughout every corner of the globe. And now we have this mono anti-culture. It's not really a culture, it's more of an anti-culture that is attempting to, through its synthesis of everything, creates nothing. But
Mhm.
yet what is predominant is sort of the like homogeneous American globalized experiment of culture that
Mhm.
is conquering, like, you know, McDonald's becomes
Mhm.
Western culture. You know, it's very tricky. I mean, I was talking about this on my podcast about how, I mean, I guess it comes up. I mean, the topic of late with the Olympic thing. What's the girl's name? The depressive case. You know what I'm talking about.
Which one?
Yeah, the Beal, whatever her, the greatest gymnast ever. That.
Oh, it just happened in the news, like
Yeah,
the
yeah.
Olympics. Yeah, yeah. To me, that's
Mental issues.
isn't it? I feel like that's black privilege. The idea of like, oh, I can just have a breakdown because I'm a victim, and the world should like love me and give me a medal anyway.
Well, there was this great thread that talked about it. I think, without getting like, you know, too controversial, I do think that Afro-American culture really is the one of, if not the most predominant cultural export of America as of late. And it seems that the exportation of American domestic, heavily racialized woke politics, like, I mean, how many, like during last summer's saintly worship of that one particular victim,
Sure,
how
sure.
many like, I made this joke in private. I said, how many, you know, people in the like how many people in Hokkaido have seen an African American person? Like the last time was when, I think the last time they probably saw one was when Bob Sapp was the IWGP heavyweight champion.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
I think it's really like this is another issue of, okay, what is culture, but what is, it seems to be that globalization is an Americanization of culture, but that culture in itself is incredibly parasitic upon these local communities and these local expressions of identity, because it inflicts upon everyone this very neurotic character of
Mhm.
people's racial grievances. One of them, of course, like, you know, this one thread, I forget who wrote it. It may have been that, what was the name, Wyatt or somebody, that says, you know, well, you teach these people that America is this evil, uh, expletive 20th century ideology, uh, terrible, racist, oppressive state, and then when you have to represent this terrible, evil, expletive, you know, then then of course there's no sort of national character that can come up in the ashes of the wake, right? Like, it's not, we're not talking about Kurt Angle here, who won the Olympic gold medal with a broken freaking neck. I mean, this is
Yeah,
you know,
yeah. That's
so.
wild. I just saw a meme about that. If I can just quickly speak to this, since I have so much experience on the other side. You know,
Yeah.
I was an English teacher, of course, studying martial arts, Buddhism, and yada yada. I would interact daily and deeply with people in Japan and Taiwan, China, etc. And this whole thing about American export culture was definitely a hot topic. And you would have Well, let me back up a little bit. So regarding the Japanese, for example, something most people don't know unless you study the language is they have a separate alphabet just for foreign words that is made so that foreign words do not infect their native language. Imagine it, that's called katakana, and it's just sort of like a phonetic alphabet. So if you were saying, McDonald's hamburger in Japanese or something, McDonald's hamburger, it would have all those little
Brembusta. Yeah.
yeah. So, or what, basketball, whatever that they would use those. So I admire that tremendously. And this is something that I feel that we can learn from them, is that we should develop these kinds of systems whereby, things are clearly, okay, that is not us. And it's, we enjoy it or we interact with it or something, but it's not part of who we are as a linguistic group or something, or a culture, for example. So, but anyway, a lot of older people in Asia, they're unhappy with younger people kind of like, dressing up like hip hop rappers or girls, acting more lascivious or various things of this nature. And, they're angry about it. They don't get on the news and you don't hear about it. But when you're an English teacher, you do hear about it, right? They give you an earful. And it's this, I guess we could say in our sphere, you have all these guys that are obsessed with like anime, manga, hentai, these kinds of things. And, not a lot of us are crazy about that either. I'm not going to get into that topic or be judgy or whatever.
Well, there's some people that believe that there will be a Asian, what's the buzz? There will be like a Sino European fusion because we share. I'm skeptical. I think that it's interesting, but then I sort of, I don't. Like I don't. I think like any sort of like cinephilia has to be tempered by the realities of these peoples and civilizations. It's sort of like we're kind of repeating Japonism, which I mean is good. Produced a lot of great artistic works, but I feel like there still is like some. I get why people in these spheres feel very squeamish about that for obvious reasons. Yeah. But yeah.
Well, it's a big topic. But let's kind of swing back around to focus on your work. I first off, I love the title of your Twitter, Gio's Sardonic Art Critic. That's great. So let's talk a bit about you. Who are you? What do you do? Your link tree is pretty huge, actually. And of course, I'll put that in the links below of the show notes. Your YouTube channel alone, I think there's a lot to discuss here. What are some of the things you do on your YouTube show?
Well, I tend to okay, so it's my sort of bread and butter is I co-host the Break the Rules podcast, which is a variety show. So for those of you who want to watch, we have different guests from all different walks of life, and we try to like put together people who are like semi-mainstream with people who are more anonymous. And just like full disclosure, my co-host Lev, he's very open about this fact. Yeah. He was born in Russia in St. Petersburg, but he is a member of the tribe, if you will. So, but we have many disagreements, and it's kind of fun how we interact. He's like kind of like a new agey, like classic liberal type of a little bit more of a like new age flair. I say this with all the love and kindness in the world.
A huge number of people in the white positive sphere, white identity politics, we grew up as classical liberals.
Oh yeah,
we didn't really know anything else. It was kind of just the norm. And then the whole thing got mutated and twisted and hijacked and whatever. But anyway,
we like a lot of it like we disagree about is like he's got this thing about Putin, and we always disagree about that one particular nation in the Middle East. But no, he's a great dude. We've had a number of bigger guests as well, and we continue to grow. And I think that what we're doing is good. but it's nice to converse. I mean, sometimes there's been a few moments where I've had to sort of clench my fist. I mean, if you look at the banner right here, that was when I debated a Ella girl. That was pretty horrific, but she's the number one person on OnlyFans. So, oh God.
Wow.
Yeah, it was, but no, it's always nice to, it's got a nice mix of everything. But my YouTube channel is different in that I try to focus a bit more on art and philosophy and not necessarily, although it always creeps up, not necessarily politics, but yeah.
We're definitely going to get into that, but let's spend a little more time. First of all, let me ask Nullus if he had any questions or comments.
Well, actually, not much. I just wanted to add that everything you talked about echoes my experience in Europe. This exportation of the lowest common denominator, what they call American culture, and it often isn't representative of what American culture really is. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of times I remember I've had heated debates over the years with my friends in Europe because their perception of the United States is also kind of based off of this Hollywood, McDonald's strip mall version of the United States. And, they don't see, the high culture that was created in the United States, over its several centuries of existence. So, there's a lot still that we have to learn from each other. And I think that by expressing ourselves through art, by expressing by speaking with each other, even if we don't agree on certain things or our perceptions aren't complete, I think that's how we can overcome these prejudices, because that still exists. And I think that's a big hurdle for let's just call it the community of European man, if you will. Yeah. And so that's a big issue, I think, where we really have to find these common denominators, because a lot of times Americans also have these preconceived notions about Europe that aren't necessarily reflective of what Europe really is. And so I think that's something that we definitely need to work on. And that's just more of a side comment to everything that you've been speaking about so far.
Well, yeah, that's great. And later, I mean, we could get into, I like how your Imperium Art essay, I think, really grounds the discussion. There's certain parts that I want to quabble with a little bit, but overall I agree with you in that essay. I think it's a good summation of where you are going as whatever you want to call it, a movement, a collective. But as for my background, I started off, I was writing for a number of, like, back when the NRX blog days were pretty big, and then they became more like magazines. Like I wrote for Adam Wallace's publication. I wrote for West Coast Then I wrote for Thermidor magazine, then the American Sun. I started off being featured in one of my favorite artists, or back when the website was still up. Are you familiar with the video artist Nobody TM?
No, actually, I'm not.
Yeah, he was pretty popular in the Chan culture sphere. Mm-hmm. I say he because there was a whole team of people doing video art and music. One of the last true video art people that was doing very, like, I would say even like esoteric things, very like the first few seasons were very political in nature, but in essence, Nobody TM was using the means of digital manipulation through film, and mm-hmm. would find like these obscure films throughout the internet and would juxtapose certain elements and filters and would really try to get at the heart of what it's like living in the sort of detritus of the modern world. Mm-hmm. And I highly recommend, there's a lot of stuff on YouTube. If you search Nobody TM, the most popular video is called YOU. And it's essentially this like almost demonic, hellish scene of these girls twerking in this dance class. And it's with this lecture by E. Michael Jones. And my thesis is that the reason E. Michael Jones is so popular is probably because of that video being spread throughout 4chan. And so that was a great, Nobody TM offered to feature my essay, which I wrote in grad school, It's the one that like really started my journey. It's called Beholding a New Pale Horse. You can find it on my WordPress, which is in my link tree. And that essay has like followed me for like, God, I think this was like 2014 I wrote it in. And then from there, I gained, a bit by being a writer. And then eventually I, did the whole like face and stuff on our podcast. And I met Lev, and he's got a bunch of connections everywhere. And then, yeah, the rest is history. Like I think like I'm one of the few people who are like, at least in the Twitter sphere, like visual artists. Like me and you and a few other people I could think, like Owen Cyclops is one, obviously. But I think there's such a dearth of actual visual artists among these. There's a few, though. There's smaller people that I know, but this always comes up perennially, I think. The question of, is painting dead? Is visual art dead? Is fine arts itself dead? And certainly it seems that way, as the aesthetic consciousness of most people has been ceded to the culture industry, to digital reproduction. And not that I'm bashing, there's a lot of great digital artists, but I think like the industry of animation is certainly another malignancy, if you will, upon younger people. The stuff that they're producing in the West, I mean, anime, there's a debate. There's a lot of great anime. I'm not a big person into anime. Like I just started reading Berserk, but when it comes to Western animation, I mean, oh my God, but it's not just animation. I think that people's aesthetic experiences are largely being formed by like I would say the culture industry proper. It seems that fine arts really has taken a nosedive, and it's hermetically sealed away from the minds of most people. So,
to that point, I'm sorry, just to add very simply that poetry is similar.
God, the death of poetry. Yes. The supposed. Go ahead. I'm very sorry, Nullus.
No, not at all. Not at all. It's just that I noticed I dabble in poetry. I really don't know, honestly, and I say this many times, but I seriously don't know how good my poetry is or isn't. But I write from my heart. I write what I feel comes naturally. I try to give it some structure. And I've noticed that if I would just write the poem, then it would not get as much traction as if, for example, I create a video and then I have some maybe either musical background to it, or just the poem with maybe some images on YouTube. Then I got a lot more traction with it. So reading my poetry has become just as important as writing my poetry and creating the media around the poetry. And in a way, it's kind of sad, because one would hope that people would just read the poem and kind of visualize everything themselves. So, but it's a sign of the times. It's also part of this digitization that we're talking about, and it's also part of the technology involved around it. So, I think that poetry, sadly, if you just look at it as a standalone, it doesn't have the kind of popularity that it once had.
Well, I mean, the publishing industry is ghastly. I mean, you could go on all day about how it's run by these harridans. I mean, my problem, I think, is that when you look at the history, especially within the North American context, the history of things like poetry and visual art, and specifically painting, you have this strong impulse of the very almost ingrained with a working class. I mean, the term working class is sort of difficult because all these Marxoids that are trust fund kiddies, they use it. But I think that the working class there was a very masculine impulse towards both poetry and painting. For instance, the American Regionalists, the Transcendentalists, which, I mean, we could talk about. It came up in your essay. I'm very surprised, actually, that you didn't take immediate castigation towards the modernist poets, for instance, E. Cummings, which I thought that was, to me, a breath of fresh air. I think that I come into a lot of heat when it comes to critiquing what I call vulgar tradism, which we can get into. But I think that your analysis of poetry was excellent. But my problem is that I don't want painting or poetry to succumb to the same fate as, for instance, ballet or classical music or things that are only kept alive by upper class rich kids who their parents
Right.
force them to do it. And it becomes this bourgeois sort of pastime for, like, it's like equestrianism, like the horse girls,
Or a hermetically sealed museum piece, if you will.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yep.
I think that's, I mean, I think that's part of the sign of the times, that if you want to be a serious artist, then you go into graphic design and you go into the industry, and then you take HRT and I'm sorry. I don't mean to, but I think that when it comes to the actual, within the art world, it seems that even the painting has seen somewhat of a revival there, but yet it's in a zombie form. It's what they call zombie figuration is the buzzword. It's a lot of the wokies have discovered painting because they're obsessed with the BIPOC body, and they have to paint the very thin, like the shadows are very purpley. They're very illustrative, right? They're not what I would consider high realism of the BIPOC body. That's the obsessive, and it seems that every time painting comes back to life, it has to go through a period of being butchered by its particular context, but yet it eventually finds its way. And I think in America, you have a lot of different schools that, in Canada a little bit too, with the Group of Seven, you have schools like the regionalists, like the Northwest people, that kept painting alive, and in Europe as well. I
love Group of Seven. I love Group of Seven.
Well, as a Canadian, I live in their shadow, obviously. Like, it's kind of like I equate painting and poetry. These are things that will never totally expire. It's sort of like, let's compare what happened to metal in the 90s. It was Pantera that kept that alive when everyone was wearing flannel and being sad. So I think that the problem, I think in the future people appreciate these things much more, because I deeply feel for poets, because I mean the publishing industry in general is just so vile and disgusting, and it's filled with Ruby Kaur, and I don't mean to bash her. She seems like a sweet girl, but I mean, come on, does she have two brain cells to rub together? I don't know. I mean, that's the Group of Seven has been very close to my heart as well. I feel like a chatterbox. I'm just going off, but
no, please, this is great.
I mean, you have immense amounts of knowledge.
I actually have a signed. This is a quick story. You'd appreciate this, Donald.
Okay.
It was a used bookstore in a city near Niagara Falls. You probably know the one. A very hipster town. And it was a summer sale in this used bookstore. And I stumbled upon a book of drawings by A.Y. Jackson. And A.Y. and Tom Thompson are two of my favorites.
And we're talking about the Group of Seven here, because I'm showing the artwork as we speak. So
yeah.
This is a really nice feature for our audience, by the way. Like,
the StreamYard, yeah.
Canadian painters. How often do we get a chance to look at that?
Oh, exactly. And the way that they, I wanted to write more about this, the way that they had to contend with nature as it was in North America, the way that, for example, the Hudson School people in America did. Sure. It wasn't like one of my favorite ones that is less known. Was William Blair Bruce, who came before the Group of Seven. He actually went to Europe. He studied with Monet. He was from Hamilton. Wow. And my father, when he was a little kid, his mother took him to the National Gallery in Hamilton, and he saw this painting by William Blair Bruce. I think it's called Journey in the Arctic or something. It's called where it's the soul of this Arctic explorer going beyond him. And my father told me about how if you type William Blair Bruce, you'll find it. But he was the one that helped teach a lot of the Group of Seven people in Ontario with A.Y. Jackson and Tom Thompson. And he was the one that brought a lot of those techniques. But the difference being is that in Europe, there was, in framing everywhere, there was industrialization. There was in Monet's paintings, it was what they called, one critic called the harem of nature in Giverny. There was always the smokestacks that came from Turner, who painted.
Yes.
Yeah, which is good. But I think that in Canada, you had, and then in America, you had the birth of true abstraction, because they had to contend with wild nature as such, nature that was untouched by human hands. Well, it was touched by indigenous. I might get put in trouble with that. But yeah, it was a different experience. But so I was in this bookstore, and I found these drawings by Away Jackson, this book of his drawings, and the way that they approached drawing even was so fundamentally different.
Mm.
And then I looked in the cover, and it was his signature. You know,
Wow.
he was doing this book tour, and I ended up paying a ridiculous, in a good way, ridiculous, with the sale and with my student sale thing. I ended up paying like $40 for this. Not that I would ever sell it though. It's very close to me.
I'm
But,
a huge bookophile. I have a massive collection
me
of
too.
art books at home, and I completely relate.
Yeah. But the Blair Bruce, it's called something in the Arctic. I forget the exact title. I have to. If you like scroll down, like if you look, no, it's called just if you type in William Blair Bruce, the Arctic, or the tundra.
Okay, we're desperately trying to find it here.
Oh,
What's happening in the scene of the painting?
It's where this explorer is. He is going, like he's seeing his soul travel, like completing the journey.
I believe this is it right here.
Let me.
Am I correct?
Yes, that. Oh, yes, yeah, yes. The Phantom Hunter. Yes,
that's exquisite.
It was this tale where in northern Canada, in the, I believe near Iqaluit, there was this phantom hunter that would visit these European explorers in the tundra, and they would and it was interpreted. The painting is about the mythology of the hunter, about the European explorer confronting wild nature as such, and all of the mythological baggage that was very alien to the European mind at the time. But my father, what he interpreted is this explorer dying, and his soul is completing the journey, which it could go either way. I mean,
wow.
But I've never talked about this in a podcast before. I'm actually quite impressed. I'm glad we went on to this, but
let me interject. I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I've just started a new show on American Zarathustra called Afternoon at the Museum.
Oh, I saw the one episode with the lovely women.
The ladies of Hearth of Europa. That was a very successful show, and I highly recommend it to the audience, everybody who's watching this show. I don't know, it's just taking off. So I want to invite you onto that show on a later date, and I mean, honestly, you could probably come on several times because, the way we're both visual artists and, we're going to yammer and go crazy. Yeah. But I love this. This is the precise experience that I'm trying to replicate here, is to bring us back into our painting tradition or our art tradition. Does not have to be the medium of painting, but that to get excited about it, to talk about it, to know some of the history, the lore,
right.
Mythology, anything and everything we can bring. The ladies in Hearth of Europa, they specialize in folklore, and they know a lot about mythology. So it crosses over perfectly into looking at paintings, in a specific period of time, because there's just so much, Another time I'd really, really like to get into Christian art and the history of that.
Yes, yeah.
Find some, maybe we'll have Tyler Hamilton on, Nullus.
Oh, yes.
Who are knowledgeable about certain things, and they can kind of get into that. But anyway, what I'm just simply saying is, you talk about the quote death of painting, and I'm like, no. I'm not gonna let it. No.
You know what you would really like? You would like our Break the Rules episode. It was just me, Lev, and Jonathan Pajot, the Orthodox carver. We get into a lot of very interesting territory, and he actually agreed with some of my defense of the modernists, if you will. But what I wanted to just really quickly, just like full disclosure, we were talking a bit about, one of the questions was about racial consciousness. I struggle with this question because, and again, I hope your audience doesn't hate me for this. I don't exactly identify as a white nat per se, because I think that I truly believe in an ethnos that maybe is regional to Europe. But I think that it's important to denote the differences between European peoples, me as a Mediterranean, but in the North American context, it's complicated because we are so in North America, we are so largely made of a sort of eclectic mixture of European cultures, and we do have similarities. I think that it goes without saying that me as an Italian can, well, maybe not relate to a Scandinavian as much, especially when it comes to aesthetic sensibilities. But I'd be painfully remiss to not be influenced by at least some Scandinavian aesthetics. I mean, Edvard Munch is certainly an artist that I've emulated my own work on. But
maybe Emil Nolde as well, and
Emil Nolde, yes.
I'm obviously literate in these things, so I can look at your work. Chaim Soutine, perhaps. I mean,
Soutine, yes. Well, Soutine brought the consciousness of the landscape to its logical conclusion around the 20th century, because his melting landscape. What would you say, Donald?
I just said that's bold. I think that I'm sorry for our audience not knowing who we're talking about. I'm going to pull up some Soutine.
Yes, pull up some Soutine, yes. Shock of the New is, Robert Hughes is one of my great art critic heroes.
That's, oh boy, you and I have so much to talk about.
Oh, yeah. Well, because Soutine really, he took so many different styles, but yet he expressed the sort of longing for the landscape in the 20th century. But the fact that it was melting away, the fact that it was being colonized, that sort of rugged warrior spirit of the European in nature that was being done away with by total mechanization. He was the one that really tried to point towards the sort of the vitality in the landscape, similar to Oskar Kokoschka. I think that's Soutine is deeply, and there was other surrealists who did the landscape quite well, although I have my problems with surrealism on a political level. But I think that Soutine is certainly another great influence of mine. But even the fact that Edvard Munch, the fact that I'm both a printmaker and a painter, I think we have very similar tact to how printmaking should be done in terms of it expressing the differences with each print. It really reveals something about the subject. It reveals a giving up to chance what is, like, for example, the Scream. I think he did so many different etchings and prints and paintings of the Scream alone. A lot of printmakers that go to, art school, as you know, Donald, they obsess over this, cleanly polished copper plate. And me, I love it. I do mostly wood cuts and wood engravings, and I do some etching, some dry point stuff, and I love just the feel of each, especially in the traditional Japanese ukiyo way, just everything being different. I love that. But I think that there is a lot of syncretism between European peoples. A good example would be El Greco, who was took the experience of Eastern Orthodox iconography and put it within a Spanish Mediterranean. That was never, people don't realize how revolutionary that is. I mean, a lot of people, because we're sort of bombarded with images nowadays, we're bombarded with the pantheon of the Google image search, that we don't realize that the aesthetic template of most people throughout European history was confined to very limited experiences. And in a way, this democratization of the image itself is something that artists have had to contend with. Right.
So quickly here, I'm jumping across. Here, we're flying through all this stuff, and I don't know how the audience can follow this. I don't want to alienate them too much, but this is El Greco here, and the works that I've shown previously, they're semi-abstract, obviously, like Soutine's paintings, for example. And then I went to Edvard Munch, which is clearer, like the focus is clearer. It's still abstract, but nowhere near as much as Soutine. Here's El Greco, who's, I don't know, a century or two before. I should know my dates. But this shows sort of the root of that whole mentality, the approach of the kind of, I don't know, the visceral liveliness of it, the high contrast areas, everything has I don't even know how to explain it. Like human anatomy even is not exactly correct. It's everything seems to sort of undulate. There's a flowing.
Exactly.
The light and the color. Yeah.
And then even like Hart Benton, which you covered in that stream.
Oh, God.
I mean, I look at Hart Benton in the regionalist example in America. I mean, El Greco influenced so much modernists, like so many of them. from
crazy.
Picasso to Braque to even Dali, right? I mean, it's like the flowing landscape, the flowing figure to me is so fascinating as someone who I consider myself an expressionist. I mean, I think like as merited as Baroque is, especially within the Christian context, I think that the mannerism went one way, it went a bit too far, but then the Baroque went another way, which was a bit, too far as well.
Yeah.
Really, the Spaniards were the ones that sort of broke tradition to arrive at something even more primordial. I mean, even Zobaran in the Baroque was just someone who was so radically different, but he was revealing something much older. He was going back to almost medieval tapestry, these demon figures, it was so exciting. And I think that's the problem I have with a lot of discourse around art in these spaces, is that breaking from tradition doesn't mean breaking from capital T tradition as such. It's breaking from a form of sort of stale academicism that always creeps up eventually. And that in order to arrive at it's very almost similar to like, as you know, Donald, in the Chinese experience, where like with literati paying, they, for example, in the Song dynasty, they get to a certain point. It's like, oh shit, we have to go back. Oh, can I swear in this podcast?
As much as you want.
Okay, yeah. They're like, oh shit, we have to go back. What are we doing? Oh my god. And then I get the critiques of some people, like for example, Giorgiani, that talks about how it stifles innovation. But at the same time, I mean, El Greco was well versed in one of the quote unquote least innovative painting traditions in the world, which is Greek iconography, which is Orthodox icons. But yet he took that and combined it with his Spaniard Renaissance Greek sensibilities and created something beautiful. And so this is what I mean. You can't really within modernism itself, there was always an implicit anti-modernism, whether it was, I mean, like, for example, Nullus, in your essay, you talk about the modernists. You talk about, for example, your critique of the transcendentalists in America, how they were sort of like these proto-hippies. And as much as I love the modernists, as much as I defend them, I think it is true at the end of the day. I mean, you can't rely on, for example, Gauguin, one of my favorites, going to Tahiti and embracing Eastern mysticism and, marrying underage Tahitian women. I think that at the end of the day, you have to be. And so in my journey, for instance, when it comes to art and philosophy and just my faith, even, I realized that as you're never going to truly, and this came up with Owen Cyclops and Break the Rules, you're never truly going to experience what it's like to be someone within those traditions. And you really have to reconcile the fact that you're not trapped within your tradition as such, but rather you have to realize that there's a certain facticity to your tradition, that there's going to be things that only you can understand within that context. There's things that me as an Italian can understand, and there's something that you as an American, and so the issue of identity is very complicated, because I live in a country where I'm almost embarrassed to admit it, but they force me, Donald. I don't strongly identify with the Canadian experience as it is, I would say, post 1965 Canada. We're jumping all over. I'm very sorry. We're jumping.
Let me pull it back. It's cool. You're like Superman. You're just flying way ahead of everybody.
I know. I have to temper myself.
You're good. I love it. It's excellent.
Oh, I'm loving this, by the way. So just
Well,
this is the goal that I'm looking for too. So quickly here, the paintings we've been showing currently is Thomas Hart Benton, an American painter, and once again, notice the sort of elasticity of everything, the flowiness, if you will, like how everything's kind of bent and almost as if it's seen through some kind of a wavy lens. And it's very amazing because, he's a painter of sort of like the Depression era America. You associate with like, sadness and, starvation and the Depression, right? But yet he somehow has this vision of America that's extremely delightful and modern in the best sense of the word. And so, these are very charming things. And that can be traced all the way back to El Greco in Spain. So, now that plugs in with Nullus's concept of continuity with our history, our heritage in the arts. And here's a perfect example of that. It's quite wonderful and quite empowering to us in the arts, in the white positive sphere. So let us take a moment just to kind of bask in that and to be inspired by that. And everybody who is in our arts to go back in time in our traditions and our histories, ethnically or racially, and say, who really speaks to me? Who did something, in the past that could inform me today? How can I reconnect to that lineage, create art of any kind, poetry, music, ballet, theater, whatever, film? Wouldn't it be amazing to see this in film form? I think that'd be amazing. This painting by Thomas Hart Benton, for example. So, and again, this show's about inspiring people and uplifting people. It's a kind of a white pill show for the arts. So,
but notice how, to speak to Nullus's essay, notice how this painting, I have to stop myself from saying notice how, because every fucking video I do on YouTube, I always say that eventually. But notice how in this painting, it's uniquely American. It's uniquely when you think of Americana, I mean, I think of Thomas Hart Benton more than I do Norman Rockwell. Okay. Because I think Rockwell had a lot of we could get into that's a whole nother discussion. But I think that with Hart Benton, you have in America, when it comes to the visual arts and to an extent poetry, you have a reawakening of certain things that were forgotten in Europe that carried over into America. Like for example, there was no greater sons and daughters of European the Impressionists than a lot of American abex, abstract expressionism, and even the regionalists. I mean, there was only one real impressionist that incurred the interest of the European conceptualists and the cubists, and that was Cezanne. Picasso said, "I do not like them. I do not like all of them, but I do like Cezanne." And so Europe went down a very conceptualist route, and we all know the story, right? But then of course with expressionism. But then when it came to the post-war period in America, it seems that they managed to retain a lot of that spirit of the Impressionists. But even before that, and during the Great Depression, there still was that common European lineage in painting. And I think that America, it's very difficult, I think, nowadays to talk about, okay, what is the culture of, let's call it, the European qua white Americana, because you have an idea of it, but it's been so thoroughly gutted and destroyed and degraded that people say things like, well, I guess America doesn't have a culture. Because I think certainly American culture isn't McDonald's and OnlyFans and Hollywood blockbusters. I think that there is something deeper within the American spirit that is new, but at the same time is very old. If that makes sense.
I'm deeply offended when people say America has no culture.
It's mayo. That's American culture. That's mayo.
Anyway, so interestingly, this show is turning into Afternoon at the Museum. So it's all good and well, but I do want to focus a little bit more maybe on your content.
All right.
So let's look at. We're going to go have a peek at your website in a second here, and then if you could kind of talk through the work that you do, why you do what you do as an artist, your methodology, how does it play a role in white well-being, if you will? And I know that that's a problematic concept for you. So
right.
Preface it first with your thoughts on, what it means to be white or not, or however you want to approach it. But
well, as a person of color myself, right. As a proud black man, Italian, right. I think that what's problematic is problematic. I know it's a buzz term. Yeah. I think that the problem is when there has to be sort of a sincerity with one's cultural expression and one's artistic expression, but also one's. I think that race certainly is a part of it, and to deny it as such is a foolish task. Mm. But I think that, to me, I have a much more expanded, let's call it traditionalist school definition of ethnicity. Actually, it would be better if you pulled up my Instagram. That's where all of my Yeah, I'm working on a website to sell directly to people, but it's been kind of like a slow process. But I think Instagram, you can find like a lot of my art, and
okay, this could be a problem because every time I go here, it asks me to log in, and then
oh yeah, I see.
I'll see. There you go.
I have a Facebook page, but that's probably
I'm banned from Facebook, so
oh okay, yeah.
But I can kind of scroll. I'll tell you what, like I can sort of scroll. For example, this piece here, and I'm going to zoom in. I hope that I don't get a pop-up interrupting this, but like it looks like you're using perhaps some ink block.
Oh yeah, my shorts. Yeah, you could. Yeah. There you go. My one etching is well, there's one of my etchings, and then there's one of my wood engravings.
Yeah.
I actually have a live stream where I do a wood engraving. I do a wood engraving of the Killdozer.
Wow.
It was his anniversary, so I think that's But to finish what I was, the can of worms I opened up, I think that when it comes to the sort of it's very complicated, this term white. I think people know what it is.
Okay.
I think that there's certainly there's a lot of similarities that people of European ancestry share, and certainly it's something that is meaningful within a North American context. But I think that when it comes, okay, so I'm opening up a can of worms. Right. When you say the term white well-being, I think it implies something more positive and more constructive than a lot of the discourse that came around during, let's say, like the alt-right proper. I think that when you're emphasizing, oh yeah, that's a drawing I did of Eggman. Shout out to my friend Eggy. I think when you're emphasizing the positive aspects of your own culture and identity and ethnicity and race, I think that to me that's something that is more meaningful to actually connect to one's experiences that is embodied within your culture, your race, your ethnicity. I think that's a better tact than simply trying to play this stereotypical heel of the establishment of Fed posting or whatever. I think that when you're actually trying to get into a deeper understanding of what it means to be European, to be within a certain ethnic and racial category, but at the same time, I think that there is pitfalls because we do have to recognize that there is a difference among people, but that difference can be overcome by our experiences within the context of being assaulted by the forces of hypermodernity. Mm-hmm. And I think that as much as I don't label myself a white nationalist, I think that there are some things that are almost unavoidable within North America, that you have to sort of realize that there is a unique culture that is tied to people's different racial experiences. And not to denigrate, like there's great artists that I admire in other cultures, but I think that it would be stupid to deny, which a lot of these normie conservatives do, that there is, like when they talk about CRT and all of these things, there is a conscious effort to, I wouldn't say, well, who knows in the future? I mean, if things become like Sarajevo, circa 1995, but I do think that there's a conscious effort to say that there's an erasure going on when it comes to people's loyalties towards their own ethnic European heritage. There's a deep sort of erasure in the sense of, American culture is, American white people are like eating mayo and going to McDonald's and living in the suburbs and, going to, resenting their parents or some stupid nonsense like that. I think that even people in America who should know better have been so thoroughly destroyed by the culture industry. But at the same time, my problem, I think, is that a lot of our political enemies, unfortunately, share the same ethnicity as we do. I mean, I think that's a problem in terms of how we're going to go about having securing a sort of stable future for people who have families and so forth, and people who do want to continue their faith and their heritage and their traditions. I think that's, I mean, it's a very complicated issue. And oh, go ahead, Nullus, please.
Yeah,
please.
if I could just speak to this, because I grapple with these topics myself. We speak about this often, even on the show. So I primarily define myself with my ethnicity, by my ethnicity. So I'm first generation born here in the United States, but my family, both of my parents and my entire family going back generations for centuries, are from Hungary. So I define myself as a Hungarian. And so as such, I would say that I'm a Hungarian nationalist in that sense.
Oh, based.
And so that's my identity. That's who I am. Now, what we have to understand when we're talking about whiteness and growing up in the United States, right? It was also kind of very strange in a way. But for many years, growing up in the United States, is kind of, if you grow up in an ethnic community, so if you grew up in an Italian neighborhood, an Irish neighborhood, a Hungarian, Polish neighborhood, what have you, then it was you, and then everyone else was an American, and whatever that meant. And so what that meant basically was, but it was implicitly understood that everybody was of European descent. And so what we have to know is that pre-1965, the concept of an American was implicitly white. And so this concept of white is pretty much a new world concept. It evolved essentially because the European man ventured out of his native continent, and he encountered the other. So by encountering the other, that Frenchman and Spaniard found commonality with each other vis-a-vis the other that they've encountered. And so that's how or the Englishman or what have you, they still understood who they were. But they still had found this common.
Wasn't there a huge population of bi POCs in medieval England? I thought that's what Mary Beard told me. That's what the BBC told me. So
before we get into that, I do also want to say, it's true. But I also want to add to that this concept of white was also a moving target, at least here in the United States.
Yes, it was.
So to be honest with you, historically speaking, yes, it was a moving target. We cannot deny this historic reality. But what it is today is what we're looking at. And what it means today is it's attacking anyone who's of European heritage in the United States. It's attacking anyone of European native heritage in Europe. It's attacking anyone of European heritage in Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, regardless of how we might define ourselves as Italians, Hungarians, English, what have you. And these are very important. I mean, as I said before, that's my primary identity. I'm not going to change that. But that doesn't mean that I don't understand the fact that A, there's a universal attack against all Europeans.
Yeah.
And B, that there is commonality that we share with each other that could be expressed through religion, that could be expressed through high art, that could be expressed through music, that there are certain elements. And what I just as a part of this conversation, what I feel we were heading toward before World War I, at least, and this Balkanization of the European man, if you will, because the Balkan Wars wasn't just limited to the Balkans. It basically Balkanized all of us.
Right.
And so what happened really before was there was this, at least culturally, a movement toward a coalescing of the European man, no matter where they lived in the world. So, for example, the Americans always, at least, again, before 1965, the average American understood politically, it was always expressed this way, that they were cousins of the English, right? Of the British. So they always referred to each other as cousins. So they knew that there was a connection here. There was an overarching theme. Even the German Amerikaner identified with his German heritage to some level. And so, but at the same time, now that we're having, if you're looking at the European Union, Europe is facing, I'm not going to, I forget her name, but that famous quote that the Europeans won't be this monolithic society, blah 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 blah.
What was
Learner,
Learner, yes.
So what? Right. Well, but what she is saying
we're
is
gonna help them. We're gonna help them be comfortable with that. I think that was the quote.
We're gonna help them disappear.
But what she's saying is important to this. But what I'm trying to say is what she's saying is important because she identifies something that is true, that there is a monolithic European culture. There are overarching themes, and there are dots that we can connect.
But it's true when they want it to be.
She's recognizing white people is what
what she's recognizing is the overarching theme. And what their goal, whoever they are, right? Because this could be defined in many ways. And I agree with you, Gio, that there's a lot of people of our own stock.
I think like certain people, there are certain people that definitely have a disproportionate thing in it, but I don't, while we're getting into hot waters here, I have a more open-ended view of like who the enemies really are.
Well, before you say anything, I wanted to say that that's exactly what I wanted to get at, is that before we point our fingers to the obvious, because it is obvious, we also have to take a look in the mirror. And we have to ask ourselves, how did we allow this to happen? And so when you have, a large portion of your own stock against their own interests, right? Then, or at least how we define it as our interests. And I think that we are correct, that it becomes a very, very difficult task, because you're talking about your cousins, you're talking about your sisters, your brothers, you're talking about your neighbors. And so these are people of your stock who are basically going against their own interests, and they don't even realize it.
But I think even the ideas themselves that have led to this, I think that they were a misappropriation of the European Faustian spirit by certain thinkers of the Enlightenment.
Yes,
I think that, it's easy to blame, it's easy to blame a certain desert people. It's easy to blame Marxists. It's easy to blame. I think that there's certainly a lot of it, but it just, for example, I remember the cultural Marxist thing. I think that it's what we're seeing now is sort of it's very different than unfortunately, yes, it's very true. Marxism is the enemy of what we're trying to do, but in terms of laying the blame, I think that. People float the idea of cultural capitalism or woke capital. I think that's more of an apt. But what you're saying, Nullus, sorry, continue. I cut you off. I'm very sorry.
No. I guess we're probably saying the same thing.
What you just outlined, I think, is probably, to me, what I'm hearing, one of the best defenses in a very nuanced view of what we would call the European white consciousness that I've certainly heard from that is leagues above a lot of the discourse around the sort of the original crop of identitarians. Some of them were quite good, but I feel that the problem with edgy meme culture is that people are lended towards a lot of misunderstandings, and then it becomes this sort of game of who has the hottest take, who has the biggest political sort of thing. But what you're getting at, I think, is a very open-ended and broad view of how you go about saying, yes, there is a thing called white people. But when they use it, when they talk about whiteness, I think that it is true to the extent that a lot of people that are fighting against, the James Lindsays of the world, I think that they do misunderstand what the academics, having been a little bit in academia, they do mean what they mean by whiteness is a very almost, I would say, metaphysical concept of collective traits. But then what happens is the activists, they take it and they bastardize it. Then you get the I'm so terribly unfortunate to share some ethnic heritage with Robin DiAngelo, where then you get the grifters like the Kendys of the world, and then the sort of nuance of what it whiteness means. Whiteness in academia has started off as pejorative, obviously, but now when people mean whiteness, they mean I guess they mean like white suburbia and like this evil racist oppressor that must be rooted out, that must be taken away from the hearts and minds of and it's like something that's like almost in a. I hate comparing it to religion, but
I'd like to jump in here because
yeah, go ahead, Donald. Go ahead. Yeah,
I just feel I'm really getting into these anti-critical race theory groups recently, and having a fabulous time J-pilling all these people that are kind of that are like basically like they won't face the facts that this is about race. They want to kind of dance around it and like, you know, post Martin Luther King memes and stuff.
It hurts everybody, Donald.
Yeah. And so
it hurts everybody.
And then they start using the dialectic of the left, like, well, whiteness, this and whiteness. I'm like, what are you talking about, whiteness? Like, we define who we are. Our enemies do not define who we are. And, you know, if we're going to use their words, then we have to create the definitions of those words.
Right.
My take, the entire thing is very simple. It's, we've made these societies. There are societies. And if you can't compete in them and you don't like them, or you, for whatever reason, just don't jive with the way we act, then get out. And that's not an insult. There's a whole world out there. There's a whole planet Earth out there. Go find your home. Go find your people. Find your culture. Find your standards. You know, someplace that doesn't have math, for example, you know, because if math is racist because it's white, then go somewhere where you don't have to worry about that.
Well, the counter argument to play devil's advocate would be that we, the Europeans, conquered the world and the colonialism. But I think, like, I mean, colonialism is maybe not colonialism proper, but certainly empire is as old as time itself. And even here in North America, the whole issue with, I guess, Justin Trudeau, he cares more about what some guy on the Montreal Canadiens did than he cares about churches being burned, churches.
Right.
And so it's ridiculous. I mean, to me, I think that I do agree that Europeans have committed a lot of grievous acts, but at the same time, I mean, this whole fetishism around they call us settlers, and I as much as I think I sympathize more with the North American Indigenous people than I certainly do immigrants that have come here. And me being a son of an immigrant, I know it's kind of like my mother came from Italy, right? So I think that it's difficult to say. I do have a sympathy for them, but then of course this whole recent, totally 100% media generated event has tested it. But I do think that we have to recognize that Europeans, because we had the ability to do so, we were better at it than everybody else. But that's not something that we should feel this collective. I mean, I know this is like a normie point and I want to get away from it, but
yeah, it's complex.
Talk about art again. It's complex, but I do think that
I do have
we can't feel guilt. I mean, my ancestors were like European, were like farmers in Italy and stonemasons. I don't feel any particular guilt over the fact that Europeans came here and Faustian spirit saw fit to inflict, which in a way was like the liberalism of its day, which was to inflict the white man's burden upon these quote unquote uncivilized people. I do wish we would have left them alone, but at the same time, I mean, the sort of I saw this article the other day in the National Post, and as much as I love Asian cultures, about like, well, you know, in Korea they wear masks all the time, and it's like, well, yeah, but we don't have the same consciousness as someone who was born in Seoul. You know, it's.
Yeah. Well, I want to ask you: have you heard of the Two-Row Wampum Treaty?
I think I have. Yeah, I think I have.
Because you and I are sort of Northwesterners, woodland people, if you will, and I did consultation for a local Iroquois government on educational things. That's a very huge, long story that generally doesn't overlap so much with our sphere. However, I just wanted to make it a point that when I say go find another place that you feel at home with, I am absolutely not referring to Indigenous First Nations people. I love and respect them, and I had a huge role in the Two-Row Wampum Treaty, which is the very first North American treaty among Native Americans or Indigenous peoples of this region and Europeans. and it
Wow.
acknowledges this is a federal treaty that the United States government acknowledges, and so it's the very first treaty that essentially says, you're here, you have a right to be here, we're here, we have a right to be here. We're two canoes on the river of life. You're gonna do your thing and we'll do our thing. We'll trade, but
Exactly.
you live your life. We're just gonna not abuse or hurt each other. Now, obviously, Europeans expand, and but the common American or Canadian, for example, this is not on their radar at all. They're ignorant of all these things. So what I'm trying to say is that Native Americans, if I can call them that, are fighting our governments. They're not fighting the people, because it's Andrew
Right.
Cuomo who's trying to tax them and take their land, not Donald Kent. You see what I'm saying? So that's a whole other ball of wax, I suppose.
Right.
But
Yeah.
I do want to just point out the significance to this context of this show and the white positive movement, that there is a federal treaty with the native people of North America acknowledging the legitimacy of Europeans on this land. This is our home. So if we could revive the Two-Row Wampum Treaty, and maybe even have asked the Iroquois to officiate maybe a new racial wampum treaty with people of other races that are living here, that is a very refreshing new idea, to kind of say we're all going to have our own paths. We're not going to abuse each other. We're going to keep separate and happy, and
that's I think that is the vision I would hope for, rather than some kind of LARP fantasy of any sort of. I think that's the best we can hope for. But go ahead.
That was the joke that my Iroquois friends would call me "dances with wolves," just for fun, just like a jab, And I mean, they're
but
really...
that's the thing. It's so insulting how these and here's the thing: the church burnings. Like a lot of them, they were burning churches on indigenous the people of indigenous heritage were going to, and a lot of them were like, can I say the anti-you-know-what on YouTube? The you know who I'm referring to?
Yeah, I know the Black Bloc, I think, is who.
Yeah, that would be a better word. Like a lot of those people that they feel this great compulsion. I mean, there's even the graves. I talked about this in the Fed post. I'm exhausted. I'm very upset with the way the government's treating it. And I mean, just the people that aren't even involved on any level, either European or indigenous. Like that one hideous ghoul in BC, part of some government committee, cheering it on, and she was some pretending to be indigenous, but she's put it this way, I think she was the dot instead of the feather, if you know what I mean.
I thought you were talking like Elizabeth Warren or somebody.
Oh no, her name is Walida.
I get it. Yeah. East Indian is what I would.
The Brahmin woman.
Okay.
Not that again, I mean, I have a great admiration for Vedanta, but I think that. That's again. I'm trying not to step on anyone's toes, but what you're saying, you and Nullus, I think is probably the best approach. And what Nullus said is deep in my experience as well, because I also grew up in a heavily Italian enclave of the Niagara region, but over time, as the old Italian people die off and go to retirement homes, the kids move to Toronto. I think that it's just a shame now we're seeing. I would say this economic colonization that is, forcing people that were, Toronto pod city urbanites down here and inflating everything because, of course, the Canadian government allows crooked Chinese businessmen to destroy our housing market. And it's just, the Chinese thing is interesting as well. I mean, I have a sort of mixed opinion. I am skeptical of people that are very enthralled by the Chinese state in these spheres, but at the same time, I don't want to go down like the rabbit hole of like the boomer tier. Like the Chinese are doing the Chinese are evil to an extent, the Chinese government, but I think like they make it like the Chinese are everything, China Joe. I am very much in the middle of that, but I do think having living in a place where the Chinese have been, heavily rigging things, if you will.
Yeah, I
And
understand.
but I blame the Canadian political class more than anyone else, because
Sure.
the Chinese, they have a long history of civilizational opportunism, and they've played the long game for so long that
Yeah.
I mean, it's a Canadian tradition that, since his daddy bowed to Chairman Mao, that, in order to stick it to the Americans, they embraced the Chinese communists.
That's awful. That's awful.
Oh, yeah.
Well, let's try to steer it back to Imperium Art. I think this is a great time to get into the discussion of the essay. So I would ask you, what points from Nullus's essay on Imperium Art really grabbed you, and what of it could you critique or say as room for improvement?
I think that what I really enjoyed was this emphasis on viewing these issues through a spiritual and mythological level. I think that there's certain things that maybe a little bit dates itself. Like, for example, you talk about cultural Marxism. I think that I have quabbles with that term, but overall, I think that it's very much, if I had to give this essay to people, I would highly recommend it. I think that it's very interesting how Nullus is able to have a reverence for a lot of the similar artists that I enjoy that are of the modernist period, and doesn't go totally into a territory of what I call vulgar tradism. I think that it's very important to realize that a lot of these movements had within it the seeds of tradition that could only be expressed within a modernist or postmodern framework. Even postmodernism itself is a very complex thing that we're experiencing. I really don't think we're even experiencing postmodernism. I think we live in a sort of age of hypermodernity that people.
What is what you just said? Something about tradism. You came up with this term just a moment ago, like a fake tradism or a
vulgar tradism.
Yeah, I wanted to say grotesque. Go anyway. What is that, and how does it play into Imperium Art?
Vulgar tradism. Again, I'm playing off the term vulgar Marxism. Vulgar. I know. To me, I think vulgar tradism is the discourse around, I guess, what people would call trad LARPing, where they specifically take the aesthetic experience of various European traditions in art, and they sort of they cross section different things, and they use different things without truly understanding from whence it arose. For example, people that will take like 19th century academic paintings, and they will pretend that this is the ultimate, and they sort of disregard how a lot of these modernists, they were trying to arrive at something much more primordial than what the sort of experience of living as a modern can provide. Albeit, I think the problems with vulgar tradism is that it doesn't recognize that the famous Evola quote, it's tradition is not the worshipping of ashes, but it's the preservation of an eternal flame. But in order to preserve an eternal flame, you have to break free of the rigidity of the particular context that you're living in. And I think the problem with a lot of traditionalist rhetoric and worship of certain aesthetics is that they're viewing things they're viewing things via negativa, in that they are using it as a cudgel against the modern world. But they don't realize that tradition in itself is a living entity that can be mitigated and sort of comes about in various ways, that isn't necessarily just like it's essentially, I'm saying that the possibility of wholesale return is in some ways impossible, because we really can't live fully through the eyes of our ancestors. We can try, we have their memory with us, but when it comes to the experience of living as moderns or hypermoderns, we have to realize that we face a lot of unique pressures.
Yeah.
But we can use them as guides, and we use them as a source of veneration. But to me, vulgar tradism, it's a very sort of basic understanding of what tradition is proper. Because to me, traditionalism implies in some ways a futurism in a lot of in art and philosophy and so forth.
How so? That seems kind of a stretch.
Yeah, I know, right? But I think because tradition should compel us forward.
Okay, that's a nice.
And it should, and like there should be a component within tradition that sustains our own sort of experiential reality. I think that it's probably good if a lot of people do things like return back to the land and become homesteaders. But I think that path is only for the few. But when it comes to how we're living in our times, we have to realize that we're just as much moderns or hyper moderns as anyone else, but that we have a different path, and we recognize that we live in a time of decay. But with that recognition, we can't fool ourselves about it. We're just as much subject to the time frame that we're living in as anybody else.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, tradition should humble you in that way. And you have to say that maybe I won't be as great as my ancestors. I won't be as great as my traditions, but we can still try. And so I think a lot of the modernist art movements were trying to do that. Mm-hmm. I think that there was a lot of seeds there of hearkening back to much older forms of tradition, but yet they were using the techniques that were very bold and innovative for the time. I think that the recognition, like for example, I don't think that you can really go back to that sort of classical academicism wholly. I think people do to a great extent. There are people who have phenomenal talent that are doing that. But when you look at a lot of people that treat painting, for instance, as this classical academic pursuit, I mean, you get stuff like the Art Renewal Center, which to me is like a hideous mockery of what tradition is. I could go for a whole hour bashing the Art Renewal Center, but I think that there has to be sort of a supreme humbleness with all of these things, and the problem is when you start to cross-cut different traditions even and come out with this amalgamation that that in a way it robs you of the potentiality of actually being embodied within your own tradition. And so the problem of vulgar tradism is that there comes with it a lot of political baggage. And I guess my critique of the essay as well, this to come full circle, is that what you're attempting with the Imperium Art essay is I would agree with, it's noble. But my one critique would be that I don't want to use art merely as a vehicle of political messaging, because I think that in a world that is so hyper political, we have to truly recognize the purpose of art on a deeper spiritual level, which you clearly pointed out, Nullus. But my problem with a lot of discourse around these issues is that in order to counter sort of like the oralist art of mass reproduction that we find within the woke shitlib culture industry, is that we combat it with like equally hyper political statements in the work of art that end up lending itself to sloganeering and tapestry and so forth and illustration. I think that we certainly, I'm not saying that we should have art for art's sake, but I think that there's a higher purpose to art that should, in a lot of ways, transcend our own political gist, if you will. That, I think that this emphasis on politics, and it's complicated because every artwork is inherently political. I do agree with that. I believe in that. But I think that the way you approach those politics, it lends itself, there's an approach that lends itself to a greater authenticity, and there's an approach that is like wholly ceding itself, the work of art, I mean, like wholly ceding itself to politics, to contemporary politics as well. I think is just the great works of political art is they're works that have managed to transcend their own facticity, their own political facticity of that era. Like I'm thinking of like even artists in the American tradition who were like ostensibly communists, they still had a great like understanding of the spiritual. I'm thinking of being a wood engraver myself. I'm thinking of like Rockwell Kent. He was a card carrying communist, but yet he had this like deeply eclectic. He was inspired by Rosicrucianism and other traditions, and he had, I think, a spirituality that could only be expressed within the American context. For example, his one wood engraving of this man who's naked in a boat gazing at the stars. It's like the sort of like one of the only spiritual experiences you can have within a North American context is under this vast nature that Faustian man has able to conquer, but yet not fully conquer. That's the dramatic tension, the Turner thesis in the American experience, right? So I know this seems like a bunch of bullshit and abstractions.
No. Let me respond, because I'm listening very, very carefully.
Right. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
And I'm embracing all of your thoughts and feelings on this as well. And I will say that where I think I'm connecting with you, I've mentioned very, very early in this show and on and off throughout the series that it's, I don't know, there's no real kind of guidebook, or it's a very difficult balancing act to be doing something that is, you're making art that has integrity, but yet is political, because it seems that there seems to be this dichotomy of art versus politics. So you were talking about examples of like aesthetic political art, and what comes to my mind is some of the really beautiful Chinese communist propaganda of the 1950s.
Oh yes,
The things are
yes,
ridiculous.
that's true.
Incredibly beautiful paintings about, it's very, it's propaganda. It portrays the Chinese as almost like the new Westerner. It's a sort of a quasi. Yeah, it's crazy. It's like a quasi, the quasi realism to it, and everybody's happily working along in the fields, and they've got their guns, and
Oh, well, the Chinese art world now, they're kicking our ass. Like, they've fully embraced traditional painting. I mean,
Oh, that's a whole nother can of worms there, bud.
Oh God, I mean. They have a different, that's a whole other stream. My God,
we should definitely do a show on that. I think you and
just to respond to this, if you guys may, there's a few things here that I do want to respond to. First of all, I fully understand the premise that Gio is making, and I find that it's a very valuable constructive criticism. But I do want to emphasize that what we're talking about here is defining what we're trying to create something out of nothing with Imperium Art. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to define something as Imperium Art. So what we're saying is, is it Western art? Yeah, it could be Western art. Is it American art, or is it German art, or what have you? Yeah, those that already exists. What we're trying to define in this case is what do we define as Imperium art? And that's a very difficult question, especially in an age where all art is politicized, because art now is predominantly in this leftist sphere where their whole ideological and philosophical premise is to politicize art. That's just the way it works in their in their worldview. So what we're talking about in this context is we're saying that we need to have an Imperium art. We need to have an art that is there to balance this highly politicized art that's there, and it exists to our detriment. It's there to deconstruct us.
Right.
And so by incorporating the Imperium art concept, we're also not saying that all forms of Imperium art should be political. In the essay, I have that. I use T.S. Eliot's position on the relationship between religion and art. And
Yes.
And I play on that a little bit. And what I say there is that you have different categories of Imperium art. You have, the organic, or the the explicit works of Imperium art. That blend various categories. You'll have the folk tales, the mythology, these national epics, these are our wellspring from which we can draw, and these are all organic expressions of who we are. And then you have implicit works of Imperium art that they could be a devotional work, and it could be expressed through various themes of Western culture or even national culture, and the metaphysical experience as well. And then the third category would be more the explicit, politicized. I would even go so far as to call it maybe a propagandistic kind of art. But I wouldn't say that Imperium art is only political. So I think that but the problem I see is you have a lot of people, for example, in the folk movements, folk music, folk dance, various movements throughout Europe and the United States. and there's a very strong leftist element in that for some odd reason. So you have these people that are organically preserving European culture, if you will, or American culture, or what, however we want to define this. But at the same time, they're espousing ideologies and views that are deconstructing the very thing that they want to preserve. And so,
they balk at Death in June, and they hate that neo-folk, evil, terrible, racist. I think sorry, did I cut you off now?
No. By all means, just go ahead.
I agree with you. There's one quote you said here. Cognitive dominance in the cultural insurgency. Right. Cultural insurgency, I think, is a great term for it. I think the problem is that the political right of all stripes have been lacking, to use a polite word, when it comes to this cultural insurgency. I mean, if only we could have various interests funding us instead of conservative boomer think tanks. I mean, I would love to get Peter Thiel money, but that's never going to happen. The European biosphere finds itself into an epic struggle to maintain its very existence. Almost every single distinctly European idea of mythos and logos have been co-opted or dismantled. Concurrently, traditional European virtues have been obliterated into a cultural obscurity, while many venerable European institutions currently experience anti-white occupation. Europeans have lost their culture war and must now utilize a different strategy. But I would also note that that's a brilliant capstone to the essay. I would note that a lot of the sentiments that were uniquely European have now been re-engineered against the European spirit itself.
Exactly.
But what I loved about your essay, Nullus, and I know like me, you, like Donald, me and you, we have various theological disagreements, but I'm well aware of without getting too, just for the sake of my own soul, without getting too black-pilled, I'm well aware of the terribly dark state of the Catholic Church as it is right now.
Yeah.
But I think that what I appreciated, Nullus, is that you were also talking about the warrior spirit as it is involved in the Christian context.
Yep.
And as much as I love, as much as I studied Nietzsche, both in academia and then outside, I do deeply disagree with that sort of like the later works in the Twilight of Idols. I understand the analysis. I do think that reason worked against itself during the Enlightenment when Christianity was sort of de-Christianized. Mm-hmm. But I do think that there is still a Kshatriya warrior spirit within the Christian context. You pointed to the sort of knightly chivalry and virtue as something that is deep within the European spiritual consciousness. And for example, at the end here, you talk about how you talk about the futurists, and of course the Italian futurists. Later on, a lot of Christian artists as well came into futurism. But you said that the dialectical of artistic violence, the warrior ethos symbolized by chivalric poems, the songs of Roland, places an emphasis on great deeds, valor, and conquest. Religious morality is not expressed through philosophic contemplation, but clear lines between good and evil. The central themes revolves around knightly virtues and in feudal responsibilities, oblast oblige, of serving kings, nation, and church. The Song of Roland epitomizes the medieval chanson de geste, which embodies the definition of ethnos and mythos within an explicit reverence to the sublime absolute authority of God. Now, that to me, I think is really special, and I think that that's what really struck me aback, because I know a lot of people within these spheres, they have a very negative view of Christianity, and some of it's warranted. I do agree, but I think that the question of universal salvation, I think the problem is that we're viewing a lot of especially mainstream theological scholarship is just terribly been colonized by these hideous ghouls on the left. And I think that the problem is that Christ promised us universal salvation, but at the same time there is a deep scholarly recognition of difference within apostolic Christianity.
Yeah.
And I think that it would be wrong to say that universal salvation within a Christian context implies this without using the actual word, the global homogeneous
Right.
salvation through temporal secularized political means.
Wow.
I think that,
I like
yeah.
that, by the way.
Oh,
Wow.
thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
But well, me and Joel, we talk about this a lot, Joel
Sure.
Davis,
Yeah.
and Tyler as well. I mean, I would love to. I want to bring both of them BTR together with Marcus. I wanted to talk to Tyler with this because he is more as learned as I am within the context of philosophy. I think he is definitely more learned than I am when it comes to Christian theology and history.
Tyler Hamilton's a great friend of our show, by the way.
Yeah. And so I think that the whole like thing between pagans and Christians, I think to me, I try to avoid those squabbles. I even try to avoid squabbles between I'm stumbling my words. The ortho bros and us Catholics. I think a lot of terribly online people, they have this fetishism around these intersectional wars, and it gets brought up. And I think we have to respect differences, but at the end of the day, I think that, without going into some kind of integralism, which I think is not going to happen, I think that should be a deep admiration and respect among both Orthodox people and Catholics, and even our pagan forebears. I think that there is room for a respect and admiration for what Aquinas called the virtuous pagans.
Yeah.
I think these online squabbles, they're against what we're trying to do. They're dividing us, and that every time it comes up, you have these weird freaks on all sides. And I'm terribly aware of the extremely online trad caths with their anime avatars and talking about various it's a lot of it's a mask for obvious sexual frustrations, but but that's a stereotype. I think the problem is when people conform to that stereotype, it denigrates discourse towards Catholicism or Orthodoxy or neo-paganism or whatnot. Sorry, I'm just.
No, okay.
I want to ask you guys. Actually, I want to ask you, Nullus, particular, your critique of the transcendentalists. I feel that you could have expanded a bit more in Imperium Art. But yeah, sorry. Finish your points about what I just said. I unleashed a can of worms on you guys. But then let's get to what you guys think of what I just said. Then the transcendentalists. So.
Well, I mean, just to maybe cap off, at least from my point of view, I again, when I'm looking at this whole topic of Imperium Art, when I'm looking at this topic of the Western kind, if you will, let's use that word, or the whites I always look at it from a bottom up kind of perspective, where I say that I look at this from the national point of view, that as a Hungarian or as an individual, I'm a part of a family. As a part of a family, I'm a part of that community. As a part of that community, these are all aspects of my identity, and it progresses up to my nationality, my ethnos, and that to me is the focal point for who I am predominantly. And then when I expand on that, that's when I'm looking for these common threads, and then in these common threads, you could find your Christian heritage, your faith. Not just so you don't. I don't like the term cultural Catholic or cultural Christian, because I think that's kind of very, I hate that. Yeah, I hate that term. But so I don't want to put it in that context. But what I'm trying to say is that we have all of these different layers of identity, and I don't look at these as priorities, which is more important or which is less important or which is not important. I look at these as symbiotic relationships of who I am. So you can't really have one without the other. I mean, if I deny my personal identity, then who am I, right? So then the question is, if I deny my ethnos, right, then where do I stand? Where are my roots, right? If I deny my faith, then what do I believe in, right? What is it that you
want a fully integrated self, in other words.
Exactly. So the self-actualization comes from understanding the synergy among all of these different levels of identity. And if we also understand this, then we also understand this continuity that I talk about also in the essay, but also in our, on various episodes, we talk about continuity. And if we understand continuity, the historicity of ourselves, right, then we understand that there is a pagan element to it, there's a Christian element to it, there's an ethnic element to it, there's an individual familial element to it, there's a a good that we're looking for. There's something greater than us. And all of these layers define who we are and give us something very unique that is who it is that we're talking about. That is Western kind. And so when we're looking at it this way, all of these arguments are, of course, I'm a Catholic. So obviously, I have very firm beliefs in that. And I would always hope that through example and not through argument, maybe I can tell someone, listen, just, let's say somebody's a pagan or somebody is a Lutheran or what have you. And I, respectfully say, listen, we might have a disagreement on this particular issue. Why don't you look at this book and see what they said here? Or why don't you just open yourself up to other possibilities while I do that as well. And I also try to open myself up to different possibilities without losing, and this is the point, and this is really the key here, without losing who you are. So don't lose. So you become a part of this community of Western kind, but don't lose your identity. Don't lose any of the layers of identity. Add to it and grow. So I think this is kind of how we're trying to contextualize Imperium Art. And then in the essay I write, visually, Imperium Art is best represented by the Norse berserker fighting alongside the Teutonic knight, the Celtic warrior fighting alongside the Roman legionnaire, the Hussite soldier fighting alongside the crusader, the Magyar horse archer fighting alongside the German man-at-arms, and so on. This is Imperium Art. This is all of this is who we are. Anyway, I'm sorry.
But I love that passage, by the way. That was, to me, that really moved me in a sense, because like you're saying, this fully integrated self, I wholly agree with. I think that, to me, I think faith tends to be a bit more important, but I would be, well, first of all, I mean, speaking about Catholicism, there's a huge undercurrent of paganism within, obviously. I don't exactly buy into the Zeitgeist tier stuff, but I do think that in terms of catechism itself, I mean, it was the pagan, especially the Hellenistic world. I mean, come on, it's obvious. I mean, which is what I don't understand about a lot of these, very, let's call them neurodivergent people, like Thomists that go into great lengths and great treaties. I don't disrespect just, I think what it was Borsey called it. He said, it's like, grug Catholicism. I think that that is, I think if you get the sort of uniqueness of it, I think it's good because, but like you're saying, like the way that me as an Italian experiences Catholicism is radically different than the way someone in, even in like across the Asiatic would experience it. Right. So
I'll give you a good example. I had a conversation with some Hungarian friends of mine. Some of them are devout Catholics. So we're not talking, some are traditional Catholics, some were not. And some were, kind of, let's just say pagan friendly, but not, outright pagan. And then you had some that were Protestant and, a wide kind of variety of people, but all were Hungarian nationalists or, patriots or however you want to define it. So I asked them a question. I said, do you find more commonality with a fellow Hungarian who's a Protestant? If you're a Catholic, do you find, and vice versa, if you're a Protestant, do you find more commonality with a Hungarian who's Catholic than you would, for example, a German who's a Protestant or a Spaniard who's a Catholic? And all of them, right away, they said that they all identify more intimately with the other Hungarian, even though they might have a different religion.
Oh, obviously.
And so when we understand this, then we understand that in the greater context of Western kind, in the greater context of the white world, if we will want to use again this term, and again, we're also evolving. So we're also trying to figure out how we can define this greater imperium, right? So when we're doing this, then we ask ourselves, do I identify more with an Irish Catholic than I do with, for example, a Nigerian Catholic? Yeah, obviously. And there's a reason why, I identify more with an Irish Catholic. Let me just put it differently. I'll identify more with a Hungarian Protestant than I would with an Irish Catholic. But I will identify more with an Irish Catholic than I would with a Nigerian Catholic. for example.
And that's not to knock the latter categories either.
No, not at all. It's just
it's
truth.
about
identity.
I mean,
It's about identity, and it's about understanding who you are, right, and where you belong in this greater scheme of things. And I see no contradiction in this within the teachings of the Catholic.
And I think like the good thing about the essay is that as much as I critique a lot of like this stuff, right? Like, I mean, the reality is that we're living through a time where I think like we can't underestimate the evil that we're experiencing. I mean, just the fact that they want not just us as white people or Europeans, but from all people around the world. I mean, the fact that they want to take away vast swaths of culture from people.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the fact that they want to homogenize us. I mean, it's such a hideous. There's no other word for it but satanic, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Because really, that is like the great leveling of being. That is the great. The sort of these people that emphasize this nonsense about how differences don't matter and all this crap. I mean, a lot of them, let's face it, I'm not talking about the average lib who maybe goes to a tech job and wherever, or goes to a marketing firm in Toronto and reads The Walrus. I'm talking about these people that have purposefully inflicted upon us these great erasures. And to me, that is really what Nietzsche called, maggots in the bread of life, because to deny anyone their cultural context, even if your culture is horrendous, I feel is a great violence. It's certainly it's a violence on a metaphysical level, in my opinion.
Yeah.
But
very well said.
Yeah.
As we're rounding out the second hour of the show, I would like to respond first off to your question, Gio, but also to just quickly say it has been amazing having you on the show.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure being here.
You're a wild stallion, an Italian stallion. And hard to rein you in, my man. Hard to rein you in. So, but that's because you're so brilliant and so well spoken.
Oh, thank you, my friend.
There's so much more that we can do, I think. So
yes,
we'll definitely have you on American Zarathustra in the future. So just respond and kind of close up the topic with the Imperium Art essay. I wanted to just share my thoughts. So Imperium Art is I would say that it's the mechanism of art war. Okay, we talk about the cultural insurgency. It's art war. And so that is our army, if you will, or that is our, I don't know, how you want to like phrase it, but we are in a culture war, and there is a white positive movement. There is white identitarianism, et cetera, and within that is the White Art Collective, and a lot of people sort of outside and around that, and people coming to it, and it's growing and growing. And the fascinating thing is, it's a ground on which whites can talk about being white,
exactly,
which is really quite fascinating, because whites are obviously not at a place where we can all talk and agree about it. And I mean, even this discussion had a lot of fascinating diversity to it, if I can use that word. We're recognizing this dual reality that we live in, which is I'm both, Italian and white, or I'm both Hungarian and white, or XYZ PDQ, Canadian, Danish, Australian. We all have these multi-layered dimensions to our identity, but within white, the age of white genocide, we're all white, and we're targeted for extinction, and we're at war, a cultural war at least. And so Imperium Art is an extremely important kind of stronghold within that context. So
we were talking about this before the stream, and again, not to offend anyone, but I think like that word itself, genocide, I would say is complicated. I think that a lot of people, they're very adverse to using that word, but I do think that there certainly are elements of, let's say, certain discourses of power that are very much bloodthirsty. That's the reality of it. But I do think that these things are much more subtle than.
That's what's insidious about it, is that it is genocide, but it's so slow. It's a death by 1,000 cuts, and that's why we go. We can't call it genocide because we don't see any guns and blood. No. It is. It's just so.
There is a delegitimization going on deeply of, European, the experience of being European itself, of being like white or being of a certain heritage or even a certain faith.
I would add here that, on the topic earlier, I'm sort of echoing what I was saying about this CRT people and the use of the word whiteness. Maybe we should replace that with the word Europeanness. You see, it because it sidesteps whatever weird neurosis people have about the term white, which a lot of people see.
That's very unfortunate that the fact that word has been so thoroughly destroyed within the public consciousness by the sort of the demonic media apparatus. I mean, that to me is it's really a hijacking of discourse itself.
Exactly. Well said. So, I mean, I hate to be too reactionary about it, but I've found that I've been creating my own dialectic for when I dialogue this stuff. And I have like judo flipped every single person in my path with these, like anti-Semitic is actually counter-Semitic and racist is actually race realist. And whiteness
that came up on Break the Rules, the counter-Semite thing. We had the illustrator Nina Paleon, who is herself of the tribe, and she actually agreed at the end. There's some. Oh, it was a very interesting stream to say the least. But counter-Semite is a very interesting word.
Nice.
Just quickly on the topic of genocide, I think that we should make a point of saying that there are many forms of genocide, and so genocide doesn't always, like Donald said, it's not like always, people grabbing machetes and just destroying others, of some other ethnicity or what have you.
It's like, I would say it's almost like in some ways an auto-genocide.
Well, there's an element to that, but I think that if you break it down, you see, this is where I just wanted to circle back a little bit to what I said earlier, that there's a certain level where we have to look in the mirror and ask ourselves how we allowed this to happen. With that said, and I wanted to add something to that, with that said, we have to understand, at least my position on this is that we have to understand that there has been decades, if not even centuries, of deliberate brainwashing going on of one form or another. Now, how that expressed itself, again, we could have a long conversation about it. But suffice it to say, it's resulted essentially in a demographic and nihilist kind of society that does not want to reproduce itself, that has no vision, that has no civilizational view of itself, that has no understanding of itself. And so what we're seeing here is a very evil form of genocide, if you will, because it's kind of what's the word I'm looking for? It's an underhanded kind of passive aggressive genocide. It's the kind of genocide that you won't recognize today, but in 30 years, it's going to be devastating.
Well, someone in the chat mentioned demographic replacement. I think that it's very interesting because, me as an Italian and a Catholic, I do have certain sympathies towards the sort of like Castizo future idea. But I do think that it's complicated because there has been a lot of, I would say, ideas, malignancies that have infected the European mind that has in a lot of ways hijacked very good intentioned ideas and it has appealed to the sort of inner nature of various European peoples that have worked to actually destroy us, because in one sense there is like the hijacking of altruism and the maternal instinct against the towards the out group, and has led to dramatic shifts, especially within continental Europe demographically. But also the reality of like the question that people are obsessed with now for warranted reasons about the sort of like, why don't we have kids anymore? I think that we live in such a hostile environment towards natalism that antinatalism is being normalized in such a breakneck speed that it's for various reasons that are very subtle and complex, but also it just comes down to as much as I'm trying to be a nuanced bro about it, I've like legit, I have heard academics that say things like, well, this obsession with demographics and people not having children, that's just white supremacy because it's about white people having kids. And it's just, but then at the same time, when it comes to, I don't want to make, again, a normie conservative take here, but I do think that antinatalism has also harmed people of other races and ethnicities as well. I think that just this monstrous attitude towards the destruction of the family, towards
which is essentially Marxist, by the way.
I mean, there's a lot of like very insane people that get published in places like Varso Books, and like that one Sophie Lewis person who wrote Full Surrogacy Now. I mean, if you read this book, it's blood curdling. It's absolutely this like theory cell Marxoid version of the quote unquote emancipation against the family. And it's you should look into this book. It's called Full Surrogacy Now. It's literally, if you want to look through the world through the eyes of Satan, if you I'm not joking. The stuff that she says is
I just wanted to answer actually circle back to your question on the transcendental idealism of the Imperium.
Yes.
Because really quickly, and then I can actually address that in this context. So again, I want to emphasize that before I want to preface it by saying that I personally feel that humanism, the Enlightenment, liberalism, we're all, they opened the Pandora's box, whether it was deliberate or unintentional, but it created a series of events that led us ultimately to this outcome. And that's what I firmly believe. Now, I don't want to go into it in more detail, but in a nutshell, that's kind of the premise that I'm taking. At the same time, I also want to emphasize that I'm not saying that everything that was created from that time to today is evil. I mean, there's a lot of great ideas. There were a lot of great movements, a lot of great literature, great art, music, and what have you.
And it reformed a lot of barbarism that was
happening. And it did. And there were some positive, there were some positive elements to it. But the biggest evil, I would say, is because you have, people talk about the European man being a hyper-individualist. That's a yes and a no, in my opinion. I think that there is an element of hyper-individualism in the European man, but there's also a sense of communalism in the European man. And I think that those were always very well balanced, or maybe at certain times in history, they weren't very well balanced. And so
like Spengler's Prussian socialist essay, that was comes to mind. Yeah. Communitarianism would be a better,
but you have that going back in antiquity, and of course there was constantly waves of when these different approaches changed. But suffice it to say, I think that humanism and liberalism, they very clearly defined the fetishization of the individual. And so we're not talking about the hyper individualism, we're talking about the fetish of the individual. And I think that is what opened up that door that led people to focus less on their responsibilities towards their family, towards God.
It sounds hedonistic.
It's hedonistic, and of course, again, we have to understand this, that there were a lot of really good ideas that came as a result of this, but that doesn't mean that the underlying concept was good or moral, because I think it was bad and immoral. But what I'm trying to get at here is that through Imperium Art, at least in this, and it's admittedly I would say the shortest part of the essay that I could have expanded a little bit more on is this last section. What I wanted to say is that through Imperium Art, I believe that we could find this kind of a consensus, this space where we can take ourselves out as individuals and find that sense of community again.
Right.
And that's really what I'm trying to get at here. And that ties into what we were talking about earlier.
And in a way, we have no choice, because that's the mission we have to do. It's very similar. The book that really influenced my writing, my era criticism, and my art even would be John David Ebert's book, Art After Metaphysics, where the artist has a great obligation to pick up the wreckage and sort of find a new something that is much more ancient than ourselves. But I think like the hyper-individualism to me is like, again, this is Luciferian. This is a total unencumbered being from everything. I mean, the fact that there's this one great line in Antigone. It was in the there was this filmmaker from Montreal who did like a modern, which I mean, they're kind of like, a lot of them can be terrible modern adaptations, but there was this modern adaptation of Antigone. It came in 2019, I think. And there was this one line, I think it was quoting from the original play, that said, "I fear the judgment of the dead more than I fear the judgment of the living." But to people nowadays, that's such an alien concept. That's to them, that's such a imposition. But when you really truly think of the monumental imposition, that in a way is liberating, because it is living your tradition and your experience as a self within the context of the aeons. It's something that, when you truly sit down to think about it. And so to me, art is a way of connecting myself to my ancestors, to my people. And I think that it's one of the only ways that truly can connect us, because when you think of the monumental weight and vastness of history, it's almost quite scary in a way. So to me, a lot of this rootless modern attitude of trying to decouple yourself from all obligations, I mean, to me, that is indicative of a poverty of imagination, because it doesn't imagine how everything that we've known, whether it's in the work of art, whether it's in philosophy, whether it's even the way we live our lives, is predicated upon the things that people that came before us built upon. And so, for instance, I mean, when you were talking about in the essay, I forget my point now. You were talking about how like the culture war thing. I know people, it's very fashionable to and in a lot of ways I agree. I mean, there's this sort of like basic this like basic conservative knee-jerk reactionary impulse towards like culture camp issues. But I think culture war is something much deeper than it's something that you and Donald, like, when I think what you two are talking about with culture war, you're not talking about like this stream of issues, even like the fucking Olympic, like the fact that she, she's so brave. She's the greatest of, embracing her own sense of narcissistic supply through the psychomedicalization complex that we're living through right now. I mean, I think to me, that's like, what I mean by culture war is something much deeper than just like, okay, this issue that comes up every once in a while, and people they like the left and the right have these positions. I mean, to me, the culture war is really just a foil for this deeper spiritual warfare that we're going through. You know, and the work of art should, to me, is this. It's not so much a weapon, but it's. I mean, it certainly is a weapon, but I think that it should be something that
it's a cure.
It's a cure. It's a manna, if you will. And so when people, like, I know certain people on Twitter, I'm not going to name names, but they're very contrarian. They talk about how that's just baseless culture war. And I think that, yes, it's true that we distract ourselves with these images that are largely media generated, but at the same time, culture war, I mean, we can't lie to ourselves. We are in sort of like a spiritual war for a very survival right now. I mean, I truly shudder to think what will happen if we continue. Like, the real black pill to me is not collapse. I think that collapse is sort of like a doomsday futurism, as we used to call in Thermidor magazine. To me, the real black pill is if this nightmarish global homogenous system finds a way to exist in a half-failed state for decades, centuries to come, and our children have to be subjected to an even shittier reality than what we're living in. To me, that's just, oh my god. It's, I don't want to think, but I know, like, to me, I have this inherent impulse towards blackpilling, but as people remind me, as people who are great Christian friends of mine remind me, they're like, Gio, despair is a sin. That's the problem. And I truly do believe that despair is a sin. And even if we have to sort of go out with, sort of a joyousness, there's something deeper about us that can't be robbed, that can't be destroyed, that can't be, to me, the work of art is, as an artist, I think, you could take the Canadian government can, bring me to the Human Rights Commission and make me a homeless beggar, but there's something that they can't take away from me. So
all I'm going to say, and I'm going to wrap up my part of this conversation with this, that if you look at Hungarian history and in the Hungarian culture, then the running theme is that we survived the Mongols, we survived the Ottomans. And this is going to be a controversial topic. I know a lot of people don't like my position on this, but we survived the Habsburgs, right? Mm-hmm. We survived them all, and we're still here, and we're still standing tall.
Yeah.
And we don't give up. You had 1956. You have now the Hungarians are standing up. We are not giving up. And by all logic and any kind of reason, we shouldn't even be around anymore. And we're still here. And we're not going to give up. And
Habsburgs were much more merciful than the Golden Horde, I think, though.
Well, but
I get what you mean. It's true.
That's another long debate. But to make a long story short, what I'm trying to say is that I even had on my show conversations with a whole topic on contra omnes invictus. We will win in spite of everything, and we have to believe that. But in order for us to believe that, we need to have a vision of the future. We need to have a vision of our civilizational destiny, and that's what we in Imperium Art. That's what I think you're doing, Gio. That's what I think that the White Art Collective is doing. We're creating this civilizational vision, and by creating this civilizational vision, they can be here for 100 years. We're still going to win.
Yeah, but Nullus, don't you want don't you want a pride parade in the middle of a Budapest? Don't you want American television? Isn't that great?
They already have it, sadly, but sadly it's a big problem. But what I'm trying to say is, though, that they could do whatever they want. That's my whole point. If we have a civilizational vision, if we have a destiny, if we feel, then I don't want it to last 100 years. But if it has to, and if it does, then we will still win. And that's really the message.
I believe God is on our side at the end of the day.
Oh God, yeah.
But to me, just really quickly, I think. Oh, sorry, Donald. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, look at how Spain came back after how many hundreds of years of being occupied by the Moors. I mean, there's something to say there. I think that what could happen is if we keep going, we'll be going on and on forever. So what I'd really like to do is wrap up the show, because we just have too many big brains in the room.
Yeah. But I just think what's happening to the Slavic people right now by the sort of the fucking European bureaucrats and this total imposed homogeneity, this fucking Banksy version of the European Union. To me, it's just so thoroughly disgusting how the Western media has been talking about places like Poland and Hungary and Serbia, and it's, to me, it's just, as a Mediterranean, I so deeply sympathize. I mean, these people, they want to destroy what Hungary is, what Poland is, what and for all these foibles, whatever foible you can point out in people like Orban, I mean, that's nothing compared to what these people want to do to you.
Right.
All these foundations that pour money into these propaganda, and all the signs are in English for some reason. I don't know why. Yeah. It's, to me, it's just, I remember talking about this way back in the day when the whole migration crisis happened. I do side with Houellebecq's thing about submission, that in some ways we're even robbing the Islamists of their own unique culture. I mean, it's just it's but it's not even us. It's this it's weird, because the sort of the ideology we're fighting, it comes from us to an extent, but it's still alien. It wants to alienate us. It's really weird. I think this sort of global homogenous ideology, I don't think it's wholly, it's something that we've played a part in, but at the same time, it's something that works against us. Whoever
I'd have an answer to that, but I think that it would be very controversial.
I know. I know.
Okay, Gio,
for the sake of my friendship with Lev, I respectfully to plead the fifth. No, I don't. Here, my honest opinion is that I do think that who you're referring to, they have a disproportionate role in it, but I don't tend to. I wouldn't want to obsess upon certain groups. I think that these issues, in some ways, they've come about, as hideous as to say, they've come about organically, and that there's certainly a lot of issues within the European spirit that have to be vivisected and worked out.
Yes.
But I do understand, like, it does seem that it's like, I know there's a lot of coincidences, but here's the thing. I don't even like to think of myself as being, I like to think that I can get along with people. I know this is my Canadian, as much as I resist, this is my, Canadian niceness, which, by the way, the Canadian niceness is a total meme, but that's another issue. But I don't disrespect other cultures. I think that people within their own facticities and their own cultural contexts are
right.
produce fruits that are maybe not equal to the European experience, but I do think that they've contributed. Like, for example, Islamic, what's that term? Anchorism, the art without figuration. I think that there's a lot of, well, let's face it. I mean, the Arab experience, the Asian experience is sort of, there's similarities there, and there's certainly civilizations that I think have more of a harmony with each other than not. But even the ones that aren't as harmonious with the European consciousness, I think they certainly have attributes and gifts that are of admiration. But when it comes to totally lowering ourselves and lowering them and lowering ourselves to this decultured gruel of global homogeneity, like, I can't express enough how odious that is. And unfortunately, I live in a country where that's our state ideology, unfortunately. So
we have to have faith. That's what I think.
Have to have faith, exactly.
Let's end on that note right there. Let's have faith, gentlemen. And I think you two give me a great deal of faith in our movement and our promising future, because we have incredible artists and brainiacs like you guys around contributing to the culture, the online culture. So I'm very, very happy to be in your company. And I just want to say thanks again. I'm going to have your link tree below in the show notes. So please, asking the audience, please do go visit, support Gio and his work and everything that he does. It's been a pleasure. And Gio, I'll definitely get in touch with you about like art museum stuff online.
I'd love to do the museum afternoons.
It'll be a blast. We're gonna have a blast. We'll plan it out a little bit ahead of time, because
we can have a specific period as well.
Sure.
Gio, thank you so much. This was such a great conversation.
Oh, Nullus, thank you. And please, I highly recommend the Imperium Art essay. I think that,
thank you.
To me, it's one of the best aesthetic writings in these spheres I've ever read.
Wow. Thank you. Wow.
Well, let's face it, there's not many to choose from.
So he set the bar quite high, didn't he?
There's people. Well, there's the shit for brains, fucking Paul Joseph Watson type of. Well, we could even have a whole stream on.
All right.
You know that joke, right? It's like, you're my favorite son, and then the answer is, well, I'm your only son.
You're my only son.
All right, gang. Thanks so much for everybody in the audience for contributing, and for your patience and an interest and your interaction with us. God bless everybody. We will win. And
God bless and goodbye.
Yes.
Thank you.
Have a great night.